A brief interlude. Approximately 15 years have passed since the Great Mix-Up. Still, no one knows how or why it happened. No scientific explanation has been reached. No deity, alien, or supervillain type has come forward to take credit. It would appear as if it just happened, as if some mysterious cosmic force picked up the Earth and shook it like a snow globe, sending everyone's consciousness into every direction, eventually settling back into new bodies with no rhyme or reason as to whose mind ended up in whose body. Scores of young became old, and old became young. People switched genders, skin color, size, shape, became blind, gained sight, and so on. Some consciousnesses flew clear to the other side of the world to find their new bodies. Others landed just a few miles from where they began. More than 25% of the Earth's human population was dead within the first 24 hours, another 15 by the end of the first month, and another 20 more by the end of the first year. More than half of all humans who had been alive before the Great Mix-Up were dead within a year of it. It wasn't only people who were lost. It was infrastructure, power, supply chains, farmland, and more. Conversely, due to the event being instant as opposed to slow developing like a plague or war, plenty of structures remained standing, and most things remained in their place after everything switched over. With the Great Mix-Up occurring in October, very few survivors who dropped into cold weather climates were prepared for winter. Many died of freezing or starvation in the months that followed. One of the things peaceful people had going for them in the early days was the catalyst for the New World itself. For as much chaos as the Great Mix-Up caused, it also spared humanity of plenty. There was no virus in the air, on surfaces or in bodily fluids to avoid. There were no undead or infected to fear, no aliens, no radiation, no well-armed men, well-trained armies, no governments, CEOs, or lawyers to force people into lives of needless work and suffering to earn the right to things like housing and healthcare. People became free to pursue new lives. They simply needed to find others like them, group up, and work together. The easiest and most obvious way was via language. Find those who speak the same language and work together. Within the first 5 years of this new era, those in search of peace and some sort of stability had been able to make it happen easier and faster than in a world ravaged by infection, war, or environmental catastrophe. Once the dust settled and people grouped up, there was a race to hoard anything they could get their hands on. Scavenging became a way of life. Some, such as the Netk, built an empire out of it. Some larger settlements grew into powerhouses. The scattering of languages and personalities made it difficult to build conquering armies or cults of any real substance. The real power was in the settling land and building, not in destroying. People did their best to adjust to their new bodies and new surroundings. Most completely left their past behind and attempted to move forward, but there were still those who continued to seek nothing more than to inflict harm. Those still alive by year 15 had accepted their new reality and were willing to fight for all they had built. Chapter 14. No matter how many times he rode one, he would never get used to the horse-drawn carriages. He thought about this as he sat in the wooden-framed carriage that had been built custom for him by craftsmen back in Old Glory. They used wood for the frame, then took old metal from cars to build the protective shell. The wheels were rubber from old cars as well. It was an odd, yet effective combination of technological eras. Tim, the driver, had been his personal carriage driver and bodyguard for a few years now. He always reminded James of a character in one of the old westerns he used to love, hemming and hawing while giving the horses all the motivation they needed to pull the carriage across what used to be Europe. Even though it had been 15 years since the last tobacco plant was harvested, while other people were hoarding food in the early days, Tim gobbled up all the cigarettes he could find. It was how he bought his way into the Netk. He gave them 50% of his stash in exchange for citizenship and a job. In the old world, Tim had lost a leg in Vietnam. As a result, He spent every day that followed living in his small Tennessee hometown, dreaming of something more. Then things changed over. When he was in the body of a fit, healthy young man with 2 working legs in what used to be Germany. A smoker since the war, he made his cigarette play. Then he hunkered down and waited for an opportunity. The Netk was it. He specifically requested a carriage driver job. He wanted to get out on the road and see as much of the world as he could. He didn't care how dangerous it was. His disappointing life had nearly been over in the old world. Regardless of how long or short his new one would end up being, he didn't want to spend it in one place. He didn't mind that his 15-year-old cigarettes were stale. Smoke's a smoke, he'd tell James. James was glad to have Tim, someone who had also seen war in the old world, someone who wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty or die, someone he could trust. It was raining. It had been raining a lot. It made the travel slower, giving James time to think. Ominous, he thought while watching lightning split the sky to the west, which was the direction they were heading. Even if he never quite got used to it, James had grown fond of traveling by carriage. He enjoyed the slow crawl. The old-fashioned quality made him feel like a boy back on the farm. Not counting Tim up front, James almost always rode alone, something he cherished since he was rarely alone in any of the places he visited for work. Time on the road was great for going over his exhaustive notes, analyzing them, hoping to pick up on something he had previously missed. In this case, he was planning how he would approach things upon arrival at the Newcastle capital. He may have been alone in his carriage, but he and Tim were not alone on the voyage. They were part of a 9-carriage Netk trader van that was heading deep into the greater Newcastle territory. James was to stop off at the capital. The caravan would continue without him, making stops along the way en route to Portstown, where they would stay for the winter. By this point, Portstown was one of the few settlements who had built a strong enough relationship with certain members of the Netk that allowed approved caravanners to spend the winter, making it possible for caravanners to take their time and not risk getting caught in dangerous winter conditions. James had no interest in ever making the trip across the Atlantic back to what used to be the United States, but he still hoped to one day visit Portstown just to see it for himself. Everyone in Netk territory knew of Portstown, the place where you could get on a ship and voyage across the Atlantic, something James would never have imagined possible in the first few years post-mix-up. The trip to Newcastle had begun in one of his favorite settlements, Old Glory, a place that had been founded by Americans in the early days of the New World. It was in what used to be central Greece. It was also the capital of the Netk. It wasn't his home. He hadn't been home in longer than he cared to remember, and was beginning to wonder if he'd ever see the Kia safe zone again. He never expected that when the news came, it would send him west to chase the lead that could finally break his case wide open. This one in Newcastle was supposed to be different, if his friends in the Netk were to be believed. It wasn't long ago that James had felt lost and hopeless. His case hadn't hit a dead end. It was simply traveling in circles. He felt like he was chasing his tail. After yet another season of his tail chasing, he had spent winter in Old Glory reviewing the same notes he always reviewed and finding nothing new. It had been one of the longest winters of his life in the New World. Then, everything changed. While sipping a glass of whiskey at one of Old Glory's inns, James found himself in conversation with a Netk master trader, someone who had safely completed 7 seasons of successful trading. She was a woman in a woman's body, enjoying her last night in town before setting off on what would be a 6-month or more route, one of the hardest routes the company ran. While still in the midst of pleasantries, he told her what he did. This caught her attention. "Oh, you're, that James." Of course she'd heard of him. Any Netk member worth their salt had heard of him. "What are the odds?" She almost yelled it. "What luck!" "What? What are you talking about?" "Hey, Adam, you, come over here." She waved another caravaner to the table. "Trust me, you'll want to hear this." The other Netk member sat down. "Tell him what you told me. Who are you?" she said to James. He told the man, Adam, who he was and what he was doing. Adam's eyes lit up. "You're him." James nodded. "And you're after the—" "Yep, that's me." Think you'll actually, get him?" "Well, it's what I did in the old world, what I do in this one, what I do best." "So, you really were a detective? Honest to God, real life homicide detective? Not just some made up rumor?" "Not bullshit. Was on the job a long time." Adam nodded. "Badass." Then he waved the server over and ordered another round for the table. "So you have something for me?" Yeah, I have something. About the, yeah. The server arrived with freshly filled glasses. James took his and sipped it without taking his eyes off Adam. He never took his eyes off someone during an investigation. You never know what they'll tell you without saying anything. "Tell me everything you know." Adam gulped half his glass, then let it all out. He told James about the teenager he met in Newcastle. He couldn't remember his name, only what he looked like. But that was irrelevant. What mattered was what he knew, who he knew. He spoke of his teacher. She'd been there since just after the first winter. Having lost her foot in the early days had made her physically unfit for travel. She was also traumatized, afraid of what's out there, or who's out there. According to the kid, she was quite possibly the only person in the world who could positively ID the mass-murdering serial killer known as the Skinner. The man who had been haunting what used to be Europe since the earliest days of the New World had managed to evade both capture and positive ID. Before that moment, James had never encountered or heard of anyone alive who could ID the killer. It was widely agreed upon that anyone who had seen him in the act had died by his hand. Then he simply blended back in with everyone else. The post-mix-up world had made it exceptionally easy for people to hide in plain sight. There were stories of a woman in Brave who had survived the massacre of Valley Falls and was rumored to have seen him and survived, but she was long gone by the time James made his first visit, apparently to Portstown, where she made the journey back stateside. James had visited the remains of Valley Falls some years back to investigate. By then, the bodies had long since been cleared from the streets and buried. The buildings had all been scavenged. All that remained was the rubble. It reminded James of some of the bombed-out European cities he had seen during the war. The place gave him the chills. He left promptly without looking back. For a time, it had been assumed that the Skinner was the result of a very sick man being in the body of someone no one would expect, perhaps a child or a teenager. Eventually, the scenes he left behind were clearly the work of someone with a lot of strength. This at least narrowed down the search to people with large, strong bodies. But considering people in large, strong bodies, primarily large, strong men, had a higher survival rate post-mix-up than any other body type, the search wasn't nearly narrow enough. Enter any settlement and you'd see countless large, strong men and women. Hell, James himself was in the body of one. The only way to catch the Skinner was to get lucky and catch him in the act, or find someone who had seen him and could positively ID him, someone who had somehow managed to escape. The caravanners hadn't met the woman who apparently could ID the Skinner. The kid said that she was a recluse and would only meet with the detective they'd heard about. James had spent just over 5 years on the case. He had seen more brutalized bodies than he cared to remember, even more than he saw in his pre-mix-up life. Yet, every crime scene, every settlement, every person he interviewed, 0 witnesses. No one who could positively identify the Skinner. "See any large men lately?" he would ask. People would always give him some version of, "Look around. Almost everyone I see is a large man." Then he would specify unfamiliar, and they would shake their heads and move on. Dead end after dead end after dead end. Dead body after dead body after dead body. Around and around and around he went. Then, somehow, some way, there was reportedly a woman in Newcastle who had apparently seen the Skinner and lived. Not only that, but she had seen him back at the very beginning. The greater Newcastle territory and Newcastle itself were arguably the most famous and respected settlement in what used to be Europe, yet James had never been. The Skinner never killed in that area. Overall, there was no real pattern for his kills. He traveled all over what used to be Europe. One year, bodies would start turning up deep in the eastern part of what used to be Europe, then nothing for a few months until word spread that bodies were turning up in what used to be France. A year later, they'd start turning up in what used to be Germany, but never in what used to be Italy. Never anywhere near Newcastle. It made sense. The greater Newcastle territory was famous for its organization and security. If you're a mass-murdering psychopath trying not to get caught, probably best to keep your distance. As a result, despite Newcastle's fame and prime location, James had never had reason to go. His New World detective career hadn't been limited to simply hunting the Skinner. He had solved countless other cases while waiting for Skinner leads. Even so, his work had never taken him within the borders of the greater Newcastle territory. They never had any cases to solve, at least not by outsiders. He really thought this could be the break that he had been waiting for. Every case, even the open and shut ones, needed a break. Something to tip the scales toward justice. James had been waiting a long time. He wanted this to be it. He also knew all too well not to get his hopes up. Every lead to this point had led nowhere, or maybe they had simply led here. The carriage couldn't get to Newcastle soon enough. Before the mix-up, James had been a centurion. Born on a farm in rural Texas in 1924, he had grown up during the Depression. It had never been easy for him, but he was strong. One could argue that he had been born strong of body, mind, and will. That life on a Texas farm during the Depression had only served to bring those inherent strengths to the forefront. Regardless, James was one tough bastard. He was 17 when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. He patiently waited the 5 months until his 18th birthday before enlisting in April 1942. He stormed the beach of Normandy during the D-Day invasion, his tour lasting until war's end. During his downtime, he managed to become fluent in both French and German. The education began back in the States during basic training and continued while abroad. School had never been much of an option on the farm. They were poor and there was work to be done. In those days, no one paid any mind to a poor farm kid not going to school. Luckily, his mother was literate and taught him to read. As a soldier, he found himself chewing through any book he could get his hands on. He was fascinated by history, the world, and most of all, by people, namely their motivations, especially after helping liberate one of the camps in the closing days of the war. Questions like why and how would haunt him forever. After the war, he received some medals and an honorable discharge, but wasn't ready to finish serving. They shipped him back to Texas, where he spent some time on the farm, but he was restless. He had seen and done too much to simply return to farming. He was barely 22 when he headed back east at the behest of one of his old commanding officers. In 1947, when the CIA was formed, he became one of its finest agents. For over a decade, James traveled the globe doing his part to aid covert operations. He also added Japanese, Italian, and Spanish to his list of fluent languages. By 1961, he had had enough of that life and was ready to return stateside and settle down. He had no desire to stay in D.C. and take a desk job either. Even though he was ready to move on from life as an agent, he was still sharp and fit, hungry for knowledge and to serve the greater good. As the calendar turned from 1961 to 1962, James had settled into a new life as a homicide detective in the Dallas Police Department, a role he would serve with great success for more than 20 years. He was even in the crowd on November 22, 1963, when President Kennedy was assassinated. In 1989, at the age of 65, he shifted from the field to a desk job. He was no longer able to be out there on foot solving crimes, but his mind and skills were still sharp, as was his passion for the work. The department was both happy and lucky to have him. During the time between settling in Dallas in 1961 and leaving field work in 1989, he had gotten married, had 3 children, and became a grandfather. It wasn't until 2004, at the age of 80, that he officially left the department and retired. His mind was still incredibly sharp, but he wanted to spend more time with his family. When his wife died in 2008, he opened a bar that would be frequented by police officers and become a popular destination for football games. People always marveled at how physically and mentally fit he was as he crossed into his 90s and finally the century mark. By that point, he was a great-grandfather. On the evening of the Great Mix-Up, he was reading to his latest great-granddaughter while she slept. Since the mid-60s, he had read to every child, grandchild, and great-grandchild while they slept. It relaxed him, it grounded him, and it made him feel connected to his descendants. He had paused reading and was watching her sleep, thinking about the life he had lived and how he would pass on before this little child was old enough to truly meet him. She wouldn't remember him reading to her. He wouldn't get to see her grow up. It made him sad, yet hopeful. That was the way of things. We're born, we live, we die. All the while, the world goes on. That was when it happened. One moment, he was watching her sleep. The next, he was in a bed in a small house. The sounds and the smell of the ocean wafting in. Most importantly, he was in the body of a very fit and very healthy 15-year-old boy. It's hard to imagine many people in the world hitting a better mix-up jackpot than James. Not only did he get to trade in his more than 100 years old body for one of 15, but he also got to keep all those years of knowledge, memories, and experience. The new brain that housed his old mind was fresh and full of energy. It was like pouring clean, fresh water into a near-empty pool. Everything was instantly sharper and clearer than it had been in years. Plus, he woke up on what used to be known as Kia Island, a small island off the coast of what used to be Greece, far from the chaos of the more densely populated areas. Once things settled down, he was able to use his multilingual abilities to bring order to the area. He became the leader of his small immediate group. But when they branched out and met others on the island, a better leader was chosen. Leadership was never his purpose. He was a soldier, an advisor, someone who got down in the muck and got things done, someone who leaders could trust to get those things done. Now that he had his youth back, that was exactly what he was going to do. Once the people on the island had weeded out anyone dangerous, things settled down and they began building a community. He spent a few years molding his new young body into the specimen his original body had been in its prime. Once he was ready, and with the island in safe hands, he set out to be of service to this strange new world. He hoped to one day return and reunite with the friends he'd made, but it would prove more difficult with each passing year. The next 3 or so years were violent and chaotic, often spent as a bounty hunter or peacemaker based out of Old Glory. His language skills helped broker alliances, develop trade routes, and form new settlements. His mental and physical abilities put a lot of terrible, violent people in the ground. Even though he never became an official citizen of the Netk, he developed a mutually beneficial relationship with them. He provided his physical and mental services. They provided resources and safe places to stay. Everything changed when he saw that first body, mutilated beyond anything he had seen in his new life, on par with the worst things that he had seen in his old one. Only the horrors he saw in Europe during World War II compared to what was being done by the mysterious serial killer locals referred to as the Skinner. He stared into the empty eye sockets of the beaten, sexually assaulted, and mutilated body of someone in a young girl's body, and realized he had a new purpose in life: hunt the Skinner down and put an end to him. A wave of excitement rushed over him when the famous towers of the Newcastle capital came into view. Everyone who lived in what was once Europe post-mix-up knew of the capital of the powerful territory. That old castle turned winery perched at the center of the powerful territory, a beacon of trade and civilization in a world that had mostly gone to hell, an inspiration to other settlements that came after. The Newcastle capital was one of the hardest settlements to gain access to, maybe the hardest. Security was famous for being tight to the level of paranoia. Getting past the border settlement into the territory wasn't particularly challenging, especially if you were with the Netk. Getting into Newcastle itself was extreme. It had been years since they had last allowed a visitor within the walls. Instead, emissaries from the capital would take meetings at the inn at the bottom of the hill that was as famous as the capital itself, or even venture to one of the satellite settlements, never within the castle. This would not be the case for James. The woman he was meeting with no longer left the safety of the capital. As his Netk sources had told him back in Old Glory, she arrived in the first year and had not ventured out since. When she agreed to meet with him, settlement officials had to approve James's admission. The approval process took more than a week. The idea of not being able to meet the person who could help bring the Skinner to justice kept him up at night. Lucky for him, the CEO of the Net vouched for him. That carried a lot of weight in the New World, especially with a place like Newcastle, who had built a strong relationship with the Net over many years of mutually beneficial commerce. Even so, Newcastle officials wanted James to conduct the interview over the radio, but that wouldn't do. He needed to look her in the eye. He needed to study her body language. He needed to be in the same place to keep the interview friendly and keep her at ease. Finally, approval was granted. James and James alone would be allowed within the gates of Newcastle to perform duties necessary to his investigation. After all, even the people of Newcastle, who were safe behind their borders and walls, had heard of the Skinner. The food at the inn was surprisingly good, quite possibly the best James had eaten in the New World. He ordered a burger. The meat was sourced from an inner GNT settlement that raised cattle. The bread came from outside the GNT via trade route established through the Netk. All the vegetables came from within the GNT. He washed it down with some ale that had been imported from what used to be Germany, a settlement known as New Bavaria. He had been there a few times in his travels. The Skinner had spent a year in the region leaving bodies here and there, even killed 2 New Bavarian scouts. As each day passed without a new lead, James found himself at the New Bavarian Central Pub washing away his frustrations. The ale was better when drank right there in New Bavaria, but it traveled well too. James had been a beer guy back in his old life. Not one of those fancy beer guys like 2 of his son-in-laws, just the cheap stuff. But he did enjoy the driveway beer one of the sons-in-laws home brewed with his friends. He hated thinking about his children, their spouses, and all his grandchildren and great-grandchild. Any time something knocked a memory loose, he did his best to put it back in its box and nail it shut. Too painful. Odds were that some were still alive, somewhere. Odds also were that some, maybe most, maybe even all, were dead. Meanwhile, he got to go on living long past 100. It's not fair. About midway through his meal, he was greeted by a young boy in his mid-teens. James instantly assumed he was the kid who had set all this in motion when he spoke with the caravanners. The kid was flanked by 2 large armed soldiers. He asked if he could join James, and permission was granted. The boy reached his hand over the table for James to shake and introduced himself. James never took his eye off the kid. He instantly clocked how natural he was, how comfortable he was in his skin. You rarely saw that in the New World. Even after 15 years, people tended to move awkwardly and uncomfortable in bodies they had no business in.
So, I'm here to talk before you go up.
Give me the rules.
Yeah, something like that.
He motioned to one of the servers for a drink. Even though the inn was crowded, the server dropped everything to handle him. Kid's important, thought James, watching without trying to be obvious that he was watching. Rules to live by. He remembered his old CIA mentor telling him, always be watching. You won't believe the things people will tell you about themselves without saying a word. Once the kid received his ale, he took a sip. If the laws of the old world USA still applied, James would think there might be an older person in that body. But in this world, almost no one was too young to start drinking.
So,
Said the kid.
the woman you're meeting, she's my teacher. Been that way as long as I can remember.
He really must be pure born, thought James.
doesn't like much like talking with anyone outside her immediate circle, and it's a small circle. She really just teaches me, then spends most of her, downtime alone, reading and looking out the window.
And she told you to speak with the caravanners?
Nah, that was all me. Since I've been old enough to meet with outsiders, seems like every other person who stops in here has some story about this Skinner. So one day I tell her about it, always telling her about the things I hear. Anyway, I tell her about the psycho been roaming around, slicing people up since the early days. At first, she reacts like anyone would, horrified. Then I mention the stuff about the face and the eyes, and she goes cold, drops her coffee, and turns white.
James leaned forward. The kid really had his attention now.
So then she, asked me to further describe the killings. I didn't really have many details at the time, but she's got this look like she wants to like tell me something, but is afraid. So the next few travelers that had stories about this killer, I asked for details, then passed them on to her. After hearing all this, she's finally ready to talk. You know what she says?
I have an idea.
Yeah, says she's seen him. Apparently, no one's seen him, but she has. Long time ago. But I guess she has. I ask what she wants to do, and she says nothing. Don't sit right with me. Not how I was raised.
So you went rogue?
Yeah, started putting the word out to all the bounty hunters and whatnot. But here's the thing. Even the baddest ass bounty hunters won't go anywhere near this one. Too scared. Even so, I spread the word to some net friends just in case. Honestly thought we'd never get anywhere. Then we got the call from you.
How'd she take it when you told her? The kid bounced his head side to side and slightly shrugged his shoulders.
Wasn't happy.
But?
Well, after, discussing it with the boss, she came around. Understands her knowledge can save lives.
James took a sip of his ale and thought about how obvious that was. This woman must have really seen something considering how scared she still was of the Skinner despite being safe behind Newcastle's walls. So what happens now? Asked James.
Finish your food. Then I take you up to the castle and you meet her. After a security check, of course. Gonna strip you down, check every corner.
James nodded. Fair enough.
It'll be you, her, me, and these two,
The armed security.
She'll tell you her story and provide details. You'll ask your questions, and that'll be that. Then you're off to a nearby green town to stay the night. No outsiders allowed in the capital beyond what's necessary. Then tomorrow you're on your merry way. Make sense?
Absolutely.
Any questions?
Yeah. You're a pureborn? The kid let out a hearty laugh.
Just came right out with it, huh? Nice.
James didn't say a word, just raised his eyebrow as if to say, well,
I am. People seem to think I'm the first.
Incredible.
Any more questions?
No, sir. James went back to his burger and ale. Once he had eaten every crumb and drank every drop, he let the kid know he was ready. He was off to meet the witness of Newcastle. The Newcastle capital was even more impressive from the inside. In his travels, James had seen a lot of settlements, more than the average New World person. Due to his profession, the reputation that came with it, and having the net vouch, he had been granted access to some of the most isolated settlements in the territory. Of the many he had seen, none could hold a candle to the capital. Everything was in tip-top shape. All the citizens were buzzing about, doing their jobs. No sign of filth or famine. No sign of struggle. No greed. No arguing. No one jockeying for power, hoarding resources, or abusing others. Things that were still prevalent in most places, especially within the Netk territory. The GNT was about as close to a utopia as James had seen in the New World. He didn't get a chance to see much at first. They took him directly to a cellar where he was stripped down and searched. It didn't bother him, considering once upon a time he had been in both the military and the CIA. Plus, even going on 15 years into the new world, he still couldn't feel self-conscious about the new body. Next, they brought him up and through the buzzing courtyard into a more modern-looking building that clearly hadn't been part of the original castle. James figured the people who once owned the winery resort had built it as an add-on. There was another similar building on the other side of the courtyard. A courtyard that gave way to a sprawling lawn that he was unable to get a good look at before being whisked through a door. He found himself inside a meeting room. It had clearly been a restaurant before the Great Mix-Up, and still had the vibe of one. It was now used as a meeting place, likely for Newcastle Council-type meetings where citizens and officials discussed news and events while making important decisions. The witness was waiting for him, sitting alone at a table, drinking wine from a nearby bottle with an empty glass next to it. No doubt for me. She was passively reading an old, worn paperback of the Dewey Decimal System, a massive international bestseller from about 5 years before everything changed over. James had read the book and seen the movie adaptation. Anything involving a detective had been of interest to him. He had long used the fish on the wall technique to break the ice with people he was about to question. Basically, try to notice something about them that you have in common and use it to make an early connection. It was easier back in the old world when he often approached people at their home or workplace. He'd quickly survey the environment, find something, and use it. Not often the case in the new world. In this situation, it was either going to be the book or the fact that she was missing her right foot. He went with the book. I remember that book. She looked up, closed the book, and flippantly tossed it aside. He took a seat and began removing his notepad and pen. Yeah. She sighed. I've, read it too many times. It's not easy to find books in English around here. Our library isn't much. Should see all the books they have in Old Glory. Her eyes lit up. Really? Yeah. Well, a home base of Netk and all. Judging by her reaction, she wasn't the biggest fan of the Netk. So, how big is this warehouse? She asked. Why? Because I want to know. He didn't like where the conversation was heading. Maybe we should. If you want to know what I know, then you'll answer my questions. Damn, he thought. She had him. Well, it's not technically a warehouse in the sense of how we, used to think of them. Net repurposed scores of old buildings in and around Old Glory to use as warehouses. Anyway, scavengers never leave a book behind. Easily tens of thousands there. You've seen this? Oh yeah. Let's just say I've seen more and know more about the net than everyone but their board. Probably more than most principals, too. But you're not a part of it? No, they're a client. Been doing jobs for them since maybe 7 or 8. Along the way, I guess I've seen it all. Exciting life you lead. Should have seen the old one. She laughed, then went quiet while staring at her beaten copy of the Dewey Decimal System, rolled her eyes, and took a sip of wine. Why so interested in the Netk and their books? He would have liked to cut to the chase, but could tell she was uneasy. So a little conversation to loosen things up couldn't hurt. Oh, well, I guess because I've been requesting a restock of our library for years. Scavengers haven't turned up any new English language books in a very long time. When we try to get some from the net, their prices are outrageous. Usually fair with other things, just not English language books. James thought about this a beat. Well, I guess in a world without movies, TV, or video games, books are really about it for entertainment. Not printing anymore. At least, not anytime soon. Right. Still, though, 1 barrel of wine for 5 books of their choice is outrageous. He nodded. Tell you what, next time I talk to them, I'll say something. How about now? Now? Well, not, right now, but like before you leave.
after we've had our talk, get on the wire and say something. Be nice to have something ready next time they came around.
He thought about it for a moment. His mind flashed on the absurd number of books being hoarded by the net. To what end, he wondered. Surely they could do without some. Yeah, I can do that.
Appreciate it.
He nodded. My pleasure. She decided to change the subject.
Wine?
She pointed to the bottle on the table with the empty glass next to it. He nodded. She slid the bottle and glass toward him. While pouring his glass, he looked around and was reminded of the pureborn and the two guards. All three had remained silent and unnoticeable since he had been in the room, there to watch and protect, nothing more. Surely they would also make certain and kept his word about wiring Netk about the books. The witness raised her glass once he was done pouring. He tapped it. They each took a sip.
So, you're the detective.
It was as if they were starting over after their initial introductions had been sidetracked by the fish on the wall. Yes, ma'am. Ma'am, okay? She nodded.
And you were a detective back then, too?
Amongst other things.
Like what?
He loved that he no longer had to lie about his agency work. None of that mattered anymore. CIA. She was impressed. Yep. Served in World War II, then CIA for a while, then detective in Dallas PD for a very long time.
Jesus. How old were you?
102. Her eyes went wide and she let out an impressed whistle.
Talk about hitting the jackpot.
He laughed. Think about it every night. She looked at the space below her ankle where her right foot once had been. He could see the sullen look of loss in her eyes. Then she took a large gulp of her wine and pushed forward.
Sounds like you just might be the right guy for this.
Been the case of my life.
So, where should I begin?
He picked up his notepad and pen, opened it to the first blank page, scribbled a bit in the top right corner to make sure it had ink. After all, you couldn't simply stroll into a store and buy a pack of pens anymore. Now that he was ready, he gave her his full attention. Let's keep it simple. Start from the beginning. Never once during his time in World War II did James feel the slightest hint of remorse killing enemy soldiers, even the ones who begged for mercy. Twice he killed men with his bare hands. The first occurred after James's gun jammed. He quickly jabbed it into the German soldier's face to stun him, cracking loose a few teeth in the process. Then he wrapped his hands around the Nazi's neck and slammed him to the ground. With the full body weight on the Nazi's chest and all his leverage directed through his hands to the Nazi's neck, the German stood no chance. James never broke eye contact as he choked the life from him. He watched the light fade from those wide eyes as the struggle vacated his body. When it was over, he didn't feel better or worse. He caught his breath, picked his gun back up, cleared the jam, reloaded it, and returned to battle. The next time he killed a man with his bare hands was in the closing days of the war. Most of the dirty work had been done. At least his part of said dirty work. His unit was traveling through a village that had been decimated. A Nazi officer was hiding out there, but the villagers were all too happy to give him up. The Allied soldiers didn't even have to ask. James and some members of his unit beat the man to death as he begged for his wretched life. Only James could understand what he was saying, but he didn't care. Other people had families too, but that didn't stop the Nazi officer from following his orders. By that point, James had been in Europe more than 2 years. He had been through so much. He had done so much. He had witnessed so much. The kinds of things no one should ever have to experience. He knew there weren't going to be many, if any, opportunities to kill enemy soldiers, let alone officers. So he and his friends took out more than 2 years of frustration on the Nazi bastard. Even in the New World, James believed that everyone he had killed in his old life had been to serve the greater good. He could live with himself for removing those people from existence. What he could never wrap his mind around, what he simply could not comprehend, was how someone could go around killing innocent, harmless people for fun. Whether it was a Nazi in Germany while he served in World War II, a foreign or domestic threat while he served in the CIA, a dangerous criminal while he was with the Dallas PD, or a sadistic New World killer like the Skinner, James believed in killing to serve the greater good, to remove those people from the board. He looked forward to watching the light fade from the Skinner's eyes as he killed him. He would happily mount that man's head over the metaphorical mantle in his memories next to the Nazi officer. For the first time ever, thanks to the witness in Newcastle, he could picture just what the head would look like. The borders of the greater Newcastle territory faded into the distance, but James didn't notice. He was too busy studying his meticulous notes. His notes were everything, his North Star, his Bible, his lifeline. It had been that way since his first case in Dallas. There was no doubt that the man who gutted people one by one in a supermarket during the first winter, the man whose face haunted poor woman's dreams and caused her to lose her foot to frostbite, was the Skinner. The M.O. was spot on. He was still working out some kinks back then, honing his craft, but it was him. James was certain. The information had been worth the trip. It was also worth the attitude he received from one of his friends at the net when he wired them about the books. They weren't too happy about the new arrangement. But they agreed that information that could break James's case wide open was worth it. So the books would ship out on the next caravan, and James had earned some goodwill with Newcastle. Now all he had to do was to wait for reports of Skinner killings. He would have liked to have stayed in the territory longer, but that was strictly forbidden, even with his newfound goodwill. Do what you came for, then be on your way. It was almost October. Winter was at the doorstep, and the Skinner was notoriously quiet in the winter, either to hunker down or to travel. No one was certain. The only thing James was certain of was that he had had some time, and time was what he wanted. The witness in Newcastle had given him an incredible physical description. Along with the notes he had been compiling for years, he felt closer to the Skinner than ever. All he had to do was wait and prepare. He decided to head to Brave, a large settlement at the very southern edge of what used to be Germany, just north of what used to be Switzerland. It was one of his favorite places to stay while playing the waiting game. Despite its size, it was quiet, peaceful, and scenic. He was always welcome. Back in year 9, James had been called to Brave to help with their own localized serial killer case. It was fall, and the Skinner had gone dormant. James was still fairly new to the Skinner case at that point. He had yet to consume his life. Someone was killing citizens of Brave in their beds while they slept. Very straightforward throat slitting. Clearly not the Skinner. It took James nearly 3 weeks, but he found the person. Turned out that a man in his 40s who had been on death row for murder in the United States had jumped into the body of a girl in her late teens. He'd used her small frame and innocent look as cover for years, telling people that he had been a mid-30s woman who had just gotten a few decades younger. No one paid much mind to him as he crept around picking locks and using nothing more than a simple tactical knife to do his work. By this point, James had solved a few similar cases in the New World. He knew that for localized settlement killings, it was likely someone using an unexpected body for cover. He interviewed every person in a young body and picked up on the person in the girl's body's inconsistencies. After some tailing and some patience, Brave's authorities caught the killer in the act. Trials were a thing of the past. Knowing he had been caught, the killer revealed his true identity and accepted his fate. He was executed less than 24 hours later after capture. After that, James was granted free roam of Brave. Any time you need a place to lay low or if you're ready to settle down, there's always room for you here, the local leader told him. He had been back many times since. They always kept a suite at the Hotel Jojo open for him, the detective suite. He was looking forward to spending the winter there, chatting over new Bavarian ales by the fire with his friend Brett, who ran the hotel. Tim and the driver, bodyguard, was also properly cared for. He stayed in a separate room. He had his own group of friends in Brave, whom he spent most of his free time with. Aside from checking in with each other every day, James and Tim lived separate lives during the winter. Along with top-notch hospitability and an ideal environment, Brave was also conveniently located. Once James got word of Skinner activity, he could head in any direction and be there as soon as possible. As always, he found a warm welcome from Brett, a fresh cask of ale, and an empty detective suite awaiting him upon arrival. Once settled, he lit a fire, poured a glass of ale, and dove deeper into his notes. As exciting and life-changing as his years in both the war and CIA had been, it was his time in Dallas that James looked back on most fondly. That was because Dallas was where he met his wife and began his family. A wife and family were not possible before Dallas. As he got older, that was what he really wanted. All he really wanted. There were only so many nights he could spend alone or with a fling in places that weren't home. He needed an anchor. He spent most nights alone in the New World. There were the occasional trysts. After all, his new body was young, attractive, and healthy. And he knew what it was like to get older and lose that. So may as well enjoy it. But it was nothing more than that. No one would ever replace his wife. While in Brave, he also enjoyed many ale-fueled chats by the fire with Brett, the innkeeper. However, most nights were spent alone thinking about his wife. Even though she had been dead a long time, she lived on in his memories. She danced across his mind a lot during that cold winter in Brave. He needed her. No one could clear his mind or take it off a case like her. In the old days, his detective days, there would be nights when he would come home and just lay in bed talking to her. They wouldn't talk about the case itself, nor anything necessarily profound or even memorable. They would simply talk about life, about the kids, about the world. Anything. It always seemed to work, to get his mind right, clear the cachet. The tough cases had a way of twisting his brain up in knots. She had a way of untwisting it. In the old world, in the years after she died, he never spoke with her. He let her rest. In the new world, however, once he began taking cases, he started talking with her again. Rarely during the first few years. More often once he began investigating the Skinner. That winter in Brave, it was every night. Every day that winter was spent hunched over his notes, going over the facts, studying maps, conversing with local friends who had an interest in the case. Most evenings were spent by the fire with Brett and occasional guests. Every night was spent in bed playing out a non-existent conversation with a long-dead woman in his mind. Never anything poignant, always minutia. Conversations that almost felt scripted. That was the point. "Did you take your multivitamin today?" the imaginary ghost of his long-dead wife asked him. "Supplements haven't existed for over a decade. I always keep a spare bottle in the medicine cabinet in the guest bathroom. I know how you're always running out." "I'll take a look next time I'm up there." "Good. I know you're not getting good meals at work. Got to get your vitamins from somewhere." "How do you know what I eat at work?" "Mark told me." Sighs. Of course he did. Or, "Book club's this weekend. Did you read the book?" "Halfway through." "So, like 10 pages in?" "More like 5. "Hun, you're the one who wanted to join." "No, I'm not. It was all you." "Just read the damn book, James." He would have killed for his wife to be alive and in bed with him and have those conversations for real. But her imaginary ghost would have to do. The case was getting to him. It may have already gotten to him after all these years. Never in his old detective life had a case consumed him like this. Whatever shred of faith he still had left in humanity after the great mix-up had been completely erased by the Skinner. The only thing left to do was find the bastard, then kill him. Then James could retire one last time. Return to the island and spend the rest of his second life on the beach, listening to the waves and conversing with his dead wife's imaginary ghost. Right on cue, as the temperatures began to rise, Traders and caravanners began showing up in Brave, as did word of the Skinner. Fresh bodies had begun turning up in the northern part of what used to be Germany. Convenient, thought James. Once he was packed and the carriage was ready, he could be up there within 2 weeks, depending on conditions. It had been a quiet, productive, thoughtful winter, even if it had been cold and haunted. He had pored over his notes several times. He spent many days and nights sharing drinks and conversations with the locals as well as the imaginary ghost of his dead wife. But it was time to move forward. Duty called. Within 48 hours of receiving his third report of Skinner activity to the north, James was back in his carriage, bumping his way to the action. This is it, he thought. This is when I get him. When he said his goodbyes to Brett and the rest of his friends in Brave, they all wished him luck and gave him encouragement. They knew where he was going and why. They had followed his case for years, hoping he could crack it. This bastard has haunted us for too long, said Brett. He's the reason I'm alone. Come back when he's dead. I want to hear all about it. James assured them he would return. He hoped he was telling the truth. The empty eye sockets stared back at him, a sight he'd seen far too many times, a sight that rivaled anything he'd saw during the war, in the agency, or on the force. Empty eye sockets were one of the Skinner's calling cards along with skinned faces, hence the obvious but local name, the Skinner. Speculation was that he removed the eyes first so his victim couldn't see what was happening to them. James often thought about what that must be like. First, experiencing the searing pain and unending darkness that comes with having your eyes carved out. Then having your body mutilated without being able to see what's happening or what's coming next. An absolute nightmare. In the old days, the Skinner would leave the eyes with the body after he was done, often placing them in the victim's hands or someplace else, or even inside the body, inside one of the many new holes he had created. At some point, he decided to keep them or dispose of them elsewhere. No one knew. According to his notes, James hadn't seen a Skinner body with the eyes in more than 2 years. This latest victim had been left outside the settlement's boundaries, mangled in excruciating ways. Every bone in each hand had been smashed, various parts removed, at least 100 different cuts, and to add to the misery, clear signs of sexual assault. He had cut her up and let her bleed to death while he assaulted her. James elected to keep this piece of information to himself. He could tell that the guide and his crew were struggling with the sight. They knew her, were probably even close. It's him, he told the local guide who had been assigned to shadow him. The bodies of the previous victims had already been cleaned up. When James got the word of Skinner activity, he sent word back not to clean up any further victims until he had the chance to examine them. Even photography was a lost art by this point. The world was mostly digital at the time of the Great Mix-Up. Whatever unused film left behind had been destroyed, lost, used, or was being preserved by year 15. Years back, James would sometimes arrive after a body had been cleaned up and be presented with photos to review, but those times had been few and far between, especially as more years passed. This had been the only new body to turn up since James gave the order not to clean them up. It had been waiting 2 days. 2 days this poor 11-year-old girl, a pureborn, had been exposed to the elements, an injustice that was not lost on James. All right, you can clean her up. I've seen enough. The guide and his crew lingered, staring at the body. You know her, don't you? Asked James. He already knew the answer. The guide, the mind of a middle-aged woman living in the body of a tall, thin, early-20s man, nodded. Daughter of 2 of the elders. They, haven't seen this, have they? No, sir. Good. Keep it that way. The settlement was called Watersway, named for its location on a body of water. James always found it interesting how settlements in the New World almost always had such simple, practical names. Newcastle was named because they created a new settlement from an old castle. Portstown because it was on the ocean, and they fished and sent ships back and forth across that ocean. New Bavaria because it was a new settlement in what used to be Bavaria. It went on like this. There were a handful of exceptions. Cannon was named because the founders liked the way it sounded. Brave for the same reason. Harmonica was one of the oldest names James had heard. He never did get the backstory for it. They were, after all, one of the least friendly settlements in the region. Even though nearly all New World settlements were nothing more than the resettling of pre-existing Old World towns and cities, no one ever carried the original name over. They all had fresh starts with new names. The Kia Safe Zone, where James had first woken up, was a rare exception, having simply changed Kia Island to the Kia Safe Zone. James thought about this from the balcony of his quarters while sipping an ale from New Bavaria and looking out at the water that inspired the name of this settlement. It was his first time in Water's Way, as it was the Skinners' first official visit to the northern end of what was once Germany. Since James went to where the Skinner went, he'd never had any reason to be there until now. The primary language in Water's Way was Spanish. Lucky for James, he had become fluent in Spanish back during his CIA days. Had he not been able to speak Spanish, his guide would have been able to translate. She had been born in Mexico and lived in Texas since her early teens. James got along with her well thanks to the Texas connection. After crossing the border illegally as a child, she and her family lived in San Antonio. That was where she was when the Great Mix-Up occurred. By then, she was in her mid-20s and working as a bartender. She had never been to Dallas. James had been to San Antonio a handful of times, usually for police business. The odds that the two had ever crossed paths were slim. Regardless, it was always nice to be around a fellow Texan. The people of Water's Way had only ever heard whispers of the Skinner before he started leaving bodies on the outskirts of their territory. To them, he had always been the problem of other people, something that the Netk traders discussed while passing through. He never hunted in their area, but when bodies began appearing, they knew exactly what and who they were dealing with and put the word out. Normally, Water's Way had an extremely strict isolationist policy, stricter than even Newcastle. They hadn't allowed a visitor within their borders in more than 5 years. All commerce was done on the outside via their small team of representatives, diplomats, and intermediaries. But, as always, James was a special case. If someone expected him to solve their crimes, they needed to trust him and cooperate with him. That meant opening their borders to him, housing him, feeding him, answering his questions, providing all necessary and available resources. Luckily, not only did his reputation precede him, but he still had the full support of the Netk, even after squeezing them for books on behalf of the witness in Newcastle. He had been welcomed in Water's Way with open arms, especially by the elder couple whose daughter had been the most recent victim. They wanted the Skinner, and they wanted him alive. They had big plans for his punishment. Before heading to bed on his first night, James sat down to write a letter to the witness in Newcastle. One of her requests upon telling him her story was that he would keep her updated via letter writing. "I miss getting mail," she had said. Mail no longer existed in its traditional sense, but between the Netk and smaller intersettlement trade routes, if one wanted to get a letter to someone, they could do it. Just needed to know the right people and have a little patience. Neither were an issue for someone like James. Dear S., I have arrived in a settlement called Water's Way. Dear S., I have arrived in a settlement called Water's Way. It is small and isolated. Saw the most recent body today. Definitely our man. He's left 6 thus far, all within a roughly 5-mile radius. Glad they put the word out when they did. Either way, I still feel behind. I'm always behind him. But I know he's close, and I am hopeful that this trip will be the one that puts an end to things. I'm tired from the traveling. Going to get a good night's sleep tonight and get to work tomorrow. Hopefully I can find him before many more bodies begin to turn up. I will continue to keep you updated with my progress. Until then, Jay. 3 weeks. He'd been in Water's Way 3 weeks and was still chasing his own tail. In that time, the Skinner had claimed 2 more. The first was a scavenger who wasn't a citizen of Water's Way, just in the wrong place at the wrong time. The body was found hanging upside down from a tree, skinned, broken, gutted, eyes missing from their sockets. The other was a man who worked as a liaison between Water's Way and traders such as the Netk, one of the few people allowed to freely go beyond the walls. No one knew why he had been outside. There wasn't a trader scheduled to arrive for at least 2 more weeks. It was clear from the bruises that he fought back, but it had been in vain. Seeing the way this person in a man's body had been manhandled was further evidence to James that the witness in Newcastle had been telling the truth. The dead man had been in peak physical condition, yet the Skinner had beaten him bad before putting him down. Only a very large, very strong man like the one she had described could do something like that. The dead man had a wife and 5 young, pure-born children. His poor wife was inconsolable. They had been together since the earliest days of the New World, and according to her had been through a lot before reaching Water's Way. She wouldn't say what, and James felt no reason to pry. Seeing what her husband's death had done to her was a sight James had seen far too many times in both of his lives, one that he could never get used to. That night and every night while in Water's Way, after briefing the elder council, James parted ways with the guide and retired to his room to review his notes and bang his head against the wall. He hadn't written the witness in Newcastle since the first time, as there was nothing to report. In the old days, James would have had the forensics team at all the crime scenes, and surely they would have found something. But all that was gone now. He was on his own. And this time, it had to be enough. He had to come through. There was one option, something he had suggested in the past at previous settlements that were under siege from the Skinner. All had understandably declined. It was a risky move that would leave them vulnerable. He never liked suggesting it, always considered it the nuclear option. And it wasn't something he could do alone. It could only be done with numbers. He was getting desperate, and this was his desperation play. Water's Way had the numbers, plus they were organized and pissed off. They may have been willing, and they maybe would even be able to pull it off. He contemplated this over a mug of New Bavarian ale while writing the witness. Dear S. Sorry I haven't written more. To be honest, there hasn't been much to say. Nothing positive, at least. And to be honest, I had really hoped that my next letter would have some good news. Alas, this one does not. More bodies. The most recent was beaten in a way that only someone like the man you described could have done. I am more confident than ever that your man is my man. Now I only have to find him. I have an idea, something that I've thought of before, something that I've suggested before, but it always gets denied. It's a risky move, but for as sick as our man is, he's smart. You don't get away with what he does for as long as he has by slipping up. We have to stop waiting. We need to be aggressive. I just don't know if I can convince the council of this. We'll see. If I can get enough people, I really think it could work. I'm presenting it to the council tomorrow. We shall see how it goes. I will keep you posted. Yours, Jay. The council had agreed to his suggestion. They hadn't loved it, but they couldn't argue with the logic. So for the first time, he was getting the opportunity to put his desperation play into action. He organized a search party. It was dangerous to bring that many people outside of the boundaries. This was why no settlement had ever agreed to it before. He was surprised just how many volunteers he had, not to mention the blessing of the council. They began at sunrise and took food breaks as more than 50 Water's Way citizens scoured every corner of land within spitting distance of their settlement. No one was allowed to be alone. Everyone was in groups, or at the very least, pairs. It was nearly sundown when someone found it. An encampment in an old, burnt-out barn approximately 2 miles beyond Watersway's borders. James ordered everyone to keep their distance while he examined the scene. There were remains of animals that had been recently killed, cooked, and eaten. There were ashes and embers from recent fires, as well as other signs of the place having recently been used as a home base. The only thing missing was the person who had been staying there. They and all their stuff were gone. James estimated that he had been gone at least 2 days. He disbanded the search party, returned to Watersway, met with the council to deliver the news that there would be no more bodies, then retired to his room for one last night. Dear S, he's gone. Moved on. We finally found where he'd been holed up, and he's cleared out by at least 3 days, probably more, likely going dark until next year. As for me, I'm heading to Brave in the morning. It's only a 2 to 3 days ride from here, and something tells me I'm going to need a lot of ale to get through this winter. Once I get settled, I'll continue my work, and hopefully when he turns up next year, I'll get the drop on him. Even though I missed him this year, I have gained a valuable piece of intel. I now know that he likes to find a single place to hole up and make camp for the summer instead of moving around night by night. I had never known for certain. It's too risky to go searching for him alone, so I never have. Next year, I won't waste any time in forming a search party and snuffing him out. Now that there's proof that it works, I should be able to convince the next settlement without much issue. I'll beg them if I have to. Glad I was finally able to try it. I don't see any other way. Hiding and waiting for this man to slip up and make a mistake puts too many lives in danger. So it's a risk we all must be willing to take. It will take a bold act to catch a bold man. As disappointed as I am, I have never been more hopeful that next year will finally be the year. In the meantime, I will keep in touch over the winter and let you know when and where the next set of bodies turns up. Yours, Jay. The sun blasted James' eyes while on the road to Brave. It was still prime Skinner season. Normally he didn't go dark until fall. I must have gotten too close. That had to be it. The Skinner must have observed James from a distance. He must have been watching. Maybe that's part of it, thought James. Maybe he likes to watch. While James had been examining the dead bodies and investigating the crime scenes, the Skinner had likely been somewhere watching, hidden from a safe distance and using binoculars. Considering James had been tracking the Skinner for years, it was safe to assume that the killer knew all about him. The thought made him uneasy. Next summer, once he reached the Skinner's next destination, James would immediately form a search party to hunt him down. No more standing around while more and more bodies pile up. No more playing the waiting game and feeling hopeless investigating the crime scene after crime scene. He would get out there and root the bastard out, put an end to him once and for all. He had proof that it was a viable option. The next settlement would understand. They would see his logic. They had to. Feeling the closest thing to satisfaction one could feel in this situation, he allowed his eyes to close and for sleep to overtake him. Sometime later he was awoken by the loud crack of a rifle blast. He would recognize the sound anywhere. His eyes opened just in time to see Tim's dead body fall to the dirt. Then the horses lost control and tore the wagon off path. The carriage rocked and jerked. It felt like it might come apart. James grabbed hold with his left hand and tried to save his files from flying off in every direction with the other. Another crack split the air in pieces, and one of the horses' heads was turned to mush. The other horse fought with all its life to pull the carriage, but wasn't strong enough. A moment later, it too lay dead next to its compatriot. James didn't hesitate. He was back in the war. Instincts kicked in like second nature. His sweaty hand grabbed his gun, and he jumped out of the carriage. He aimed in every direction, finger on the trigger and itching for payback. He squinted against the blinding sun, but saw nothing. Another shot ripped through the air, this one connecting with his right kneecap. It exploded like a watermelon. He fell to the ground. His gun flew from his hand. bounced a few times and landed just within reach. The pain was relentless. He had seen some kneecaps back in the war, the way people screamed when it happened. None of that could prepare him for experiencing it himself. For all the gunshot wounds he had seen, he had never experienced one himself. With all the urgency of his more than 100 years on this planet, he reached for his gun. It was kicked away before he could wrap his fingers around it. The foot then connected with James's face, sending him to his back, where he watched as the figure of a very large, well-built man stood over him. "Hey, detective. Nice to finally meet after all these years." James laughed. "You've got to be kidding me. Always 5 steps behind, until lately. Really picked up the pace. So now I got to take care of you." Who are you? Does it even matter at this point?" James let out a long, deep sigh, but didn't say a word. The Skinner knelt so James could get a look at him. He was exactly as the woman in Newcastle had described him, right down to the colorful, full-sleeve tattoos on each arm. Only about 15 years older. "Last words?" James shook his head. "Out of respect, I'm going to put you down clean and keep your face intact. But I gotta hang you from that tree over there as a message. You understand, right?" James didn't bother moving nor acknowledging. "Yeah, you understand." He stood back up, pointed his gun at James' chest. James closed his eyes and pictured his wife as the Skinner put 2 bullets through his heart.